Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today we are continuing the storyline titled Ghosts in the Snow. This is episode 5. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
24th of February to 6th of March 2028. The death of Nurse Anya ripped the fragile veil of hope from the Yagodnoye Provincial Clinic. The quiet, anxious waiting was replaced by a stark, palpable fear. Dr. Ivanov, his face a grim mask of exhaustion and grief, immediately placed the clinic under a strict lockdown. No one was permitted to leave. He made a grim, terse call to the district authorities, and within hours, the town's single dirt road was blockaded, not by a simple barrier, but by a military checkpoint. 2 heavy green Ural trucks and a handful of soldiers in winter gear, their faces obscured by masks and goggles, had arrived to enforce the quarantine. They were now officially cut off from the world. The focus of that world, Chloe, was seemingly unaware of the chaos. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her small room and the increasingly dense fog descending upon her mind. The aggressive rabies they had feared had not materialized. Instead, something quieter and infinitely more insidious was taking root. Her condition had evolved into a deep, rasping wheeze that accompanied every breath. The fever returned, a stubborn, dry heat that left her drenched in sweat. The static she had complained of was now a constant presence. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at the wall. "It's like the words are there," she whispered to Ben one afternoon, her voice raspy. "But when I try to put them together in my head, they just fall apart." The rabies protocol they were following now felt like a hollow, meaningless ritual. Kira was consumed by the mystery. The negative rabies test from her field kit, combined with Anya's terrifyingly different death, was a contradiction she could not let go. "This is not rabies," she said to Ben and Dr. Ivanov, her voice filled with a desperate certainty. "I am a field biologist, not a specialist, but I know this is wrong. The data from my kit, Anya's symptoms, Chloe's symptoms, nothing aligns. The sample has to get to a real lab. I need to go." Her desperate plea led to a new, high-stakes plan. The regional supply helicopter out of Magadan was their only link to the outside world, a lifeline the military quarantine had not severed. "The pilot owes me many favors," Dr. Ivanov said grimly. "He can take 1 passenger, to deliver the sample directly to the regional diagnostic laboratory in Magadan. It is the only way to get immediate answers." There was no question who had to go. Kira was the only one with the scientific knowledge to convey the urgency and complexity of the situation. Despite Ben's vehement objections about splitting the team, Kira's logic was undeniable. The risk of inaction was far greater. The day the helicopter arrived was bright and bitterly cold. The rhythmic thump of its rotors was the first truly hopeful sound they had heard in days. Ben and Dr. Ivanov met the pilot on the makeshift landing pad, a cleared patch of ground behind the clinic. Kira took the precious, cold-steeled canister with the reverence of a holy relic. The pilot, a stoic man with a thick mustache, promised to deliver her directly to the lab director in Magadan. As the helicopter lifted off, kicking up a blinding cloud of snow, Ben felt a small, fragile sliver of hope return. Answers were coming. The next 2 days were a descent into a new kind of hell, one defined not by a frantic race, but by a slow, agonizing watch. The hope brought by the helicopter faded with every passing hour that Chloe's condition worsened. The wound on her hand was healing beautifully, a cruel irony, but the rest of her was deteriorating in ways that terrified the small clinic staff. Her condition was no longer a simple ailment. It had deepened into a constant rasping wheeze that was the new, grim soundtrack of their lives. It was a dry, rhythmic, mechanical sound. It was the sound of her body breaking down from the inside out. The fever remained, a stubborn, dry heat that left her drenched in sweat and shivering under thin wool blankets. Dr. Ivanov administered every antipyretic he had, but the fever clung to her, a sign of a deep, systemic battle her body was decisively losing. But it was the change in her eyes that was the most horrifying. The static she had complained of had now completely taken over. The bright, ambitious young woman they had trekked through the wilderness with was gone, replaced by a vacant, listless shell. She would stare at the wall for hours, her expression blank, her eyes unfocused, only reacting with severe pain and anger when the overhead lights were turned on. She no longer initiated conversation, and when they spoke to her, her responses were slow, fragmented, or non-existent. She was there, but she was not. On the third day after the helicopter's departure, the call came. Dr. Ivanov took it in his office, with Ben standing by, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. The doctor listened for a long time, his back to Ben. He said very little, just a series of quiet affirmatives. Watched the rigid line of the doctor's shoulders. He saw them slump, just slightly, a visible deflation of hope. Finally, Dr. Ivanov hung up the phone. He turned around slowly, his face ashen, his eyes holding a look of profound confusion and frustration. "The laboratory in Magadan has completed the preliminary tests," he said, his voice a low, unsteady monotone. Kira was right to be concerned. The test for lyssavirus was negative, completely negative. A wave of cold dread washed over Ben. It wasn't rabies. The treatment was useless. "So what is it?" Ben pressed, stepping forward. "Did they identify it?" Dr. Ivanov shook his head, looking completely bewildered. "This is the strange part. They ran a standard viral panel. It is testing positive for morbillivirus. Measles." "Measles?" Ben echoed, incredulous. "That's impossible. Chloe is fully vaccinated, we all are. And these aren't the symptoms of measles. Where's the rash? The Koplik spots?" "Exactly," the doctor said, rubbing his tired eyes. "They see the same thing. The biological markers say measles, but the clinical symptoms do not match. Not at all. The lab director said the sample is contradictory. He said they have never seen a morbillivirus present this way. The aggression of the animal, the neurological decay in your friend, the rapid respiratory death of Anya, it does not fit. So they don't know what it is," Ben stated, his voice flat. "They do not," Dr. Ivanov confirmed. "They have begun the process to sequence the full genome, but that will take time. They do not have the funding or equipment to do it quickly. The director is officially flagging it as a VUI, a virus of unknown significance." He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. "He is petitioning his superiors for permission to coordinate with international bodies, specifically the WHO and American CDC, given that your team is involved, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head again. "But what?" Ben asked. "But due to the current political tensions over the war in Ukraine, he says it is highly unlikely the federal government in Moscow will authorize sharing a novel biological sample with a NATO country's organization. He said they will want to keep it in-house. He is fighting, but he is not optimistic." The message was brutally clear. They were caught. Not just by a quarantine and an unknown virus, but by geopolitics. The hope of a swift, international response was a fantasy. They were on their own, adrift in a sea of scientific uncertainty and bureaucratic red tape. Just as the weight of this new reality settled over them, a sudden, violent crash echoed from down the hallway, followed by a sharp scream of pain and terror. They ran. Chloe's room was in chaos. A young, well-meaning nurse, one who had helped with Chloe over the past week, was on the floor, scrambling backward, a look of pure shock and horror on her face. Chloe was standing in the middle of the room, her movements no longer listless, but jerky and spastic. Her hospital gown was torn at the shoulder. Her head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and her eyes, once filled with light and ambition, were now milky, vacant, and fixed on the terrified nurse. The only sound she made was the constant, dry, rhythmic wheeze of her breathing. She had been trying to get out of bed, and the nurse had gently tried to guide her back. In response to the touch, something had snapped. The vacant shell had been filled with a sudden, mindless, reflexive aggression. Before Ben or the doctor could react, Chloe lunged. It was not the coordinated attack of a predator, but a clumsy, spastic burst of movement. She fell upon the crying nurse, not with claws or fists, but with her teeth. She bit down hard on the nurse's shoulder, her jaw grinding with that same mindless, unnatural force the kitten had displayed. The nurse's scream became a raw, agonized shriek. The sound ripped through the quiet clinic, a terrifying echo of the scream Chloe herself had made in the snow a lifetime ago. The cycle of infection, the one they had so desperately tried to stop, had just begun anew. The nurse's agonized shriek galvanized them into action. Dr. Ivanov, moving with a speed that belied his age and exhaustion, grabbed a heavy metal tray from a nearby cart. Ben, acting on pure instinct, tackled Chloe from the side, his shoulder driving into her ribs. The impact was jarring, like hitting a bundle of taut, vibrating wires. He was shocked by the wiry strength in her small frame. She didn't fight him with skill or intent. She thrashed, her limbs moving in spastic, unpredictable jerks. That horrible, rhythmic wheezing sound was loud in his ear, a mechanical death rattle. Mac, despite his own growing malaise, lunged forward and pulled the terrified, sobbing nurse out from under the fray, dragging her into the hallway. "Get back!" he roared at the other staff who had poked their heads out. Chloe's teeth, still grinding, tore free from the nurse's shoulder, leaving a gruesome, bloody wound. She made no sound, no cry of rage or pain, just that constant, awful wheeze. Ben wrestled her arms, trying to pin them, but her movements were too chaotic. Dr. Ivanov brought the metal tray down hard on the back of her head. The sound was a dull, sickening thud. Chloe went limp, collapsing in a heap on the floor, unconscious. The only sound in the room was the sudden, ringing silence where her wheezing had been. For a moment, everyone just stared, breathing heavily. Ben looked down at the still form of his friend, his heart pounding with a toxic mix of adrenaline, fear, and profound sorrow. The vibrant, ambitious woman he knew was gone, replaced by this violent, mindless shell. "Get her on the bed," Dr. Ivanov commanded, his voice shaking but firm. "Lock the door. Now." He rushed to the injured nurse, who was now being tended to by a pale, trembling colleague. The bite mark on her shoulder was deep and severe. The doctor's face was grim. He knew he was looking at the next victim. The immediate crisis was contained, but the implications were catastrophic. Chloe could no longer be treated as a patient. She was a threat. While Dr. Ivanov locked the door to Chloe's room, Ben used the doctor's radio to call the small contingent of soldiers at the town's blockade, his voice a strained, urgent plea for help. 45 minutes later, 4 soldiers in full hazmat gear arrived, their faces obscured by the reflective visors of their gas masks. They looked like astronauts, alien figures in the small, failing clinic. They subdued Chloe, who had since regained a state of spastic semi-consciousness with a brutal efficiency that was hard to watch. They used thick leather restraints to strap her to the metal frame of her medical bed. She did not fight them with purpose. She simply thrashed against the bonds, her milky, vacant eyes showing no recognition, no fear, only a blank, horrifying emptiness. The constant, rhythmic wheezing had returned. They left her like that, a caged animal, and locked the door behind them, posting a guard in the hallway. The clinic, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and the fear was palpable, living thing. But the virus was no longer just a contained monster in a locked room. It was already loose. Mac was the next to fall. His lingering malaise had worsened dramatically over the past day. His dry, hacking cough had become a deep, wet, rattling sound that shook his entire frame. He had tried to hide it, toughing it out with his characteristic stubbornness, but after the incident with Chloe, the facade crumbled. He collapsed in the common area, shivering uncontrollably, his skin slick with a feverish sweat. They put him in a room at the opposite end of the hall from Chloe, but there was a terrifying sense of inevitability to it. He was following the exact same grim path as Nurse Anya. The strong, cynical, seemingly indestructible photographer was being dismantled from the inside out by the airborne acute form of the virus. Ben sat by his bedside, a helpless observer, as Mac's condition deteriorated with horrifying speed. The powerful lungs that had drawn breath on every continent on Earth were now failing, filling with fluid. His lucid moments became shorter, his periods of feverish delirium longer. And he was not the last. The nurse Chloe had bitten, despite immediate and aggressive wound care, developed a raging fever and debilitating migraines within 24 hours. She was already weeping, begging for the overhead lights to be turned off. It was the exact incubation profile of the bite vector. Furthermore, 2 other clinic staff members, who had been in close contact with Anya days prior, also fell ill with a deep, wet cough. The virus was cutting a swath through the small clinic, a silent plague operating on 2 entirely different fronts. Dr. Ivanov and the few remaining healthy staff worked in a state of exhausted, terrified triage, their faces perpetually hidden behind masks, their movements quick and furtive. Hundreds of kilometers away, in the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Regional Diagnostic Laboratory in Magadan, Kira Petrova was fighting a different kind of battle. The initial relief of having an answer had been replaced by a bureaucratic nightmare. The lab director, Dr. Sokolov, a cautious, weary man, had confirmed her worst fears. "It is not measles," he told her, showing her the electron microscope images. The virus particles were the right shape for a paramyxovirus, but their protein spikes were all wrong. "The standard morbillivirus test is giving us a false positive because of a shared benign protein sequence. This is something entirely new, a novel lineage of the mononegavirales order." He had immediately filed a report with Vector, the Russian State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology in Novosibirsk, flagging the sample as a virus of unknown significance, naming it LXV-28, and recommending a Level 4 biohazard classification. The response had been swift, but not in the way Kira had hoped. "They have classified the information," Sokolov explained, his face grim. "All data related to LXV-28 is now under federal jurisdiction. We are ordered not to publish and not to share our findings with any non-Russian entity without explicit authorization from Moscow." "That is insane," Kira exclaimed, her voice echoing in the small office. "My team is American. The CDC has some of the best viral sequencers and epidemiologists in the world. We have to coordinate with them. This isn't about politics, it is about public health." "To you and me it is," Sokolov said wearily. "But to a bureaucrat in Moscow, in the current political climate, an unknown, highly dangerous virus discovered in Siberia by a joint Russo-American team? It is a political problem first, a scientific one second. They are afraid of what it could look like. They are afraid of the Americans claiming they discovered us conducting unsanctioned biological weapons research. So they lock it down." For 2 days, Kira waged a frantic, desperate war via email and telephone. She argued with low-level functionaries at Vector. She pleaded with contacts she had at the university. She sent a carefully worded, encrypted message to a former colleague now working at the WHO, hinting at a novel paramyxovirus with a bizarre dual pathogenicity, hoping to create pressure from the outside. But all the while she was feeling off. It had started with a headache, A dull throb she attributed to stress and the harsh fluorescent lighting of the lab. Then came the fatigue, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of coffee could penetrate. On the third day, as she was in the middle of a heated phone call with a dismissive official from the Ministry of Health, it started. A small, dry tickle in her throat. She tried to clear it, but it persisted. She took a sip of water, but it didn't help. The official on the other end of the line was droning on about national security protocols when she was suddenly overcome by a harsh, dry, hacking cough. The official stopped talking. "Dr. Petrova, are you all right?" Kira couldn't answer. She was bent over her desk, her body shaking with the force of the cough. A cold, liquid dread poured into her stomach, a feeling far worse than any bureaucratic frustration. It was the exact same respiratory onset that had killed Anya. "I have to go," she managed to gasp into the phone before hanging up. She stumbled to the small restroom adjoining the lab and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her skin slick with a sudden clammy sweat. Her eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were glassy with the onset of fever. She knew with a terrifying absolute certainty what was happening. She had been in the room with Chloe for days, breathing the same air long before she ever got on the helicopter. She had not been the messenger escaping the plague. She had been its vessel, and she had just delivered it to the heart of a major port city.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series as the virus spreads across Siberia. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for listening.